I never thought the man I married would betray me in the cruelest way possible, by making me raise the child of his mistress. Marriage, to me, had always symbolized loyalty, partnership, and the sacred bond of building a family together. Yet, here I was, bound by vows that had turned into shackles, forced to mother a child who was not mine, a living reminder of his betrayal. The sting of that realization cut deeper than words could ever describe, because it wasn't just about the child. It was about how little my pain mattered to the man who once swore to protect me. In those first days, my world spun in silence. Outsiders would look at me and see a devoted wife, a nurturing mother, someone who held her household together with grace. But beneath that fragile surface, there was turmoil. Every time I held that child, every time I soothed his cries, I wondered how a man who claimed to love me could dare to place such a burden on my heart. It was more than betrayal. It was humiliation. The whispers of neighbors, the veiled stares of relatives, the pitying eyes of friends, they all became daggers that sliced through my already fractured soul. And yet, I did not scream. I did not run. I did not lash out. Instead, I endured. That was what shocked people the most, my silence. They mistook it for acceptance, as though I had swallowed the bitterness and chosen to live with it. But what they did not understand was that silence has many faces. For me, it was not surrender. It was strategy. Each day I played the role assigned to me. I fed the child. I managed the home. I stood beside my husband in public. On the surface, I was the picture of composure. Inside, however, I was keeping score. Every sleepless night, every tear I shed behind closed doors, every bitter glance I hid when no one was watching, they were not signs of weakness, but fuel for something far greater. I became a master of masks. To my husband, I appeared obedient. To the child, I appeared maternal. To the world, I appeared unshaken. But within, I was quietly rewriting my story. I knew that patience was my weapon, and time was my greatest ally. Because revenge isn't always about striking fast. It's about striking right, when the moment is so precise that the impact is undeniable. So as the months passed and the weight of betrayal pressed harder against my chest, I learned to carry it differently. I stopped asking why me and started asking what now. My silence was not an admission of defeat. It was the calm before the storm, a storm my husband would never see coming. And when it finally arrived, he would understand that the woman he underestimated, the wife he betrayed, the mother he forced me to become, was the same woman who would ultimately bring him to his knees. From the outside, our marriage looked like a dream. People often told me how lucky I was to have a husband like him, handsome, ambitious, and seemingly devoted. They saw us at dinners, smiling across the table. They saw us at family gatherings, standing close, exchanging playful remarks that painted the picture of a couple deeply in love. And I believed it too. I clung to that image of us because it was everything I ever wanted. A marriage built on trust, loyalty, and the promise of a future we would create together. I remember the early days vividly. The way he held my hand like it was something fragile and precious, the way he spoke about building a home filled with laughter, children, and memories. I gave my whole heart to him because I thought I had found my partner, my confidant, the person who would walk beside me through every joy and storm. For years, I poured myself into the marriage. I cooked his favorite meals, supported his career ambitions, and waited eagerly for the day when we would welcome children of our own. My devotion was not half-hearted. It was complete, unquestioning. Yet even in those days of apparent perfection, subtle cracks began to form, cracks I was too blind, too trusting, to acknowledge. At first, they were small. Nights when he came, home later than usual, offering vague excuses about work dinners or unexpected meetings. Calls he would step outside to take, lowering his voice just enough that I could not make out the words. I brushed them aside, convincing myself that this was what came with having a hard-working, ambitious husband. He's building our future, I told myself. He's doing it for us. But deep down, a faint unease stirred. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would reach across the bed and feel the cold sheets where he should have been. He would return hours later, his tie loosened, his expression tired. I would greet him with concern instead of suspicion, asking if everything was all right. His reassurances came too easily, smooth, practiced, as though he anticipated the question. And I accepted them, because the alternative was too painful to imagine. I wanted so badly to believe in the man I had married that I silenced the whispers of doubt. I told myself every couple went through phases, that small distances did not mean betrayal. I compared us to others and felt grateful, because compared to broken marriages and public scandals, ours still seemed intact, even enviable. That illusion became my comfort, my shield against the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath the surface. Looking back now, I realize how eager I was to protect the image of us. I ignored the way he sometimes looked away when I asked simple questions. I dismissed the strange perfume that lingered faintly on his shirt, convincing myself it must have been from a colleague brushing past him at work. I laughed off the fact that his phone was always face down on the table, notifications muted, locked with a password he never shared. Love made me naive. Or maybe it simply made me desperate to preserve the happiness I thought I had. And so, I played my part. I smiled in photographs, clapped proudly at his achievements, and told anyone who asked that I was the luckiest woman alive. I created a narrative for myself, one where late nights meant sacrifice, not secrecy, where distance meant stress, not betrayal. I crafted excuses so carefully that I almost convinced myself they were true. Because to admit otherwise would have meant admitting that my marriage was not what I thought it was. There were moments, though, when the mask nearly slipped. Once, I caught him staring at his phone with a faint smile, a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen directed at me in months. Another time, when I suggested we plan a weekend getaway, he hesitated too long before agreeing, as though calculating how to rearrange obligations I wasn't supposed to know about. My heart ached, but I swallowed the hurt. I told myself it was temporary, that he was simply overwhelmed, that marriages required patience. Empathy kept me bound to him. My love was so deep that I always looked for reasons to excuse him rather than condemn him. If he was distant, I thought, maybe I wasn't being supportive enough. If he was irritable, maybe I wasn't understanding his pressures. I blamed myself for the silences, the unanswered questions, the gnawing void that grew between us, and that self-blame made me cling even tighter, as though if I just loved him harder, the cracks would disappear. But cracks don't disappear. They spread, they widen, and sooner or later, they reveal the truth you've been too afraid to face. At that time, however, I remained blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant. I was the devoted wife, the loyal partner, the woman who still believed in the fairy tale. And he was the man who played his part so well that I convinced myself the shadows in our marriage were merely passing clouds. What I didn't know then was that those shadows would soon become storms. Storms that would tear apart everything I thought was real. But in that moment, in the fragile illusion of our perfect marriage, I remained hopeful. Hopeful that love would conquer doubt. Hopeful that loyalty still meant something. Hopeful that the man I married was still the man I believed him to be. It was a beautiful lie. And it was only the beginning of the nightmare. It began, as so many truths do, with something small. Something so ordinary that most people would have overlooked it. A stray receipt folded into his wallet, carelessly tucked away between credit cards and business notes. I wasn't looking for it. In fact, I was searching for some spare cash when the thin slip of paper caught my eye. A receipt from a boutique hotel across town, time-stamped for a Tuesday afternoon. The same day he had told me he was trapped in endless meetings. At first, I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a work-related event. Maybe he met a client there. But the pit in my stomach twisted tighter with every maybe I conjured. The charges didn't look professional. Champagne for two, a suite. My hands shook as I stared at the ink, the evidence that my carefully constructed world might be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The unease I had buried for months surged to the surface. Late nights, hushed phone calls, unexplained absences. It all clicked together like jagged puzzle pieces. My chest tightened, not just with suspicion, but with the horrifying possibility that I had been living beside a stranger. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Love makes fools of us, and I was desperate not to be one. Yet the questions gnawed at me, so relentless I couldn't sleep. Days later, unable to quiet my racing mind, I followed him. It was a decision born not of malice, but of desperation, the need to know if my fears were shadows or the looming truth. That night, hidden in the dim glow of streetlights, I watched as he pulled into the driveway of a small apartment building, one I had never seen before. My breath caught in my throat when a woman emerged from the shadows to greet him. She smiled with familiarity, with intimacy, and when he leaned in to kiss her, the air left my lungs entirely. My world collapsed in a single moment. Silent, brutal, undeniable. The man I had devoted myself to, the man I trusted with every fragile part of me, was living a double life. And worse, he wasn't just unfaithful. He was in love with her. I could see it in the ease of his gestures, the way he touched her face like it was the most natural thing in the world. The same tenderness he had once reserved for me was now hers. I don't remember driving home. The night blurred into a haze of tears and gasping breaths, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The image of them together replayed in my mind, cruel and unrelenting. Betrayal wasn't an abstract fear anymore. It was flesh and bone, lips and lies. When he came home hours later, I was waiting. The house felt unbearably quiet, as though even the walls held their breath. I stood in the kitchen, the receipt spread out on the table between us like a verdict. He froze when he saw it, his face flickering with surprise before settling into a mask of indifference. "What is this?" My voice trembled, though I tried to steady it. He glanced at the paper and then at me, and to my horror, he didn't deny it. He didn't scramble for excuses or stammer with guilt. Instead, he sighed, as if I were the one burdening him. "You weren't supposed to find that." The words cut deeper than any denial could have. My chest burned, my throat raw with the effort to breathe. "So it's true? There's someone else?" His silence was an answer sharper than 1,000 confessions. Finally, he said it, cold and unrepentant. "Yes." Tears blurred my vision, but anger surged through the heartbreak. "How long?" I demanded, my voice rising. "How long have you been lying to me?" He leaned against the counter, casual, almost bored. "Does it matter? It doesn't change anything." Doesn't change anything? The life I thought we shared, the vows we had spoken, the future I had dreamed of, it all shattered, and he had the audacity to treat it like an inconvenience. His arrogance stunned me, a cruelty sharper than the betrayal itself. "You let me believe—" My voice cracked under the weight of fury and grief. "You let me believe in us. In you." He shrugged, an infuriating gesture of dismissal. "You wanted the fairy tale. I gave you what you wanted for as long as I could, but people change. I changed." The arrogance in his tone, the unapologetic justification, it was unbearable. He spoke as though I should understand, as though betrayal were simply a chapter in the story of marriage. My heartbreak was met with indifference, my tears with disdain. I begged him, not for myself, but for the truth. Was it love? Or was it just lust? The faint smirk on his lips told me everything before his words did. It started as lust, but now? He paused, his eyes softening in a way that made me sick. Now, I think it's more. It felt like he had stabbed me twice, first with the betrayal, then with the confirmation that I had been replaced, discarded like something old and useless. My knees buckled beneath me, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "I gave you everything," I whispered, my voice breaking. "And this is what you give me in return?" For a flicker of a second, I thought I saw guilt in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You'll survive," he said coldly. "You always do." That was the moment something inside me shifted. The man standing before me wasn't just unfaithful, he was unfeeling. He had crossed a line so deep that forgiveness was impossible. My heartbreak hardened into something sharper, something more dangerous. I realized then that my silence, the same silence he mistook for weakness, was about to become his greatest miscalculation. Because while he reveled in his arrogance, dismissing my pain as trivial, he had no idea what I was capable of. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his reckoning. I thought the worst had already happened. I thought discovering his affair, hearing him admit that another woman held his affection, was the sharpest knife he could drive into my chest. But I was wrong. What came next was a wound deeper than betrayal, heavier than heartbreak. It was humiliation so profound it made me question my very existence. It began with silence. After our confrontation, we barely spoke. Nights were cold wars fought with slammed doors and stifled sobs. I avoided his gaze, terrified that even one glance would unravel me further. I braced myself for divorce papers, for more cruelty, for a separation that would at least let me breathe. But instead, one evening, he sat across from me at the dining table, his posture unnervingly calm, his voice stripped of hesitation. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a man announcing business terms, not like a husband breaking his wife's spirit. "She had the baby," he said flatly, not even using the mistress's name. "It's mine." The words didn't register at first. They echoed, in my mind, hollow and surreal, bouncing against the walls of my sanity until they landed with full force. I froze, spoon halfway to my lips, my body refusing to function as my heart lurched violently against my ribs. "What? What did you say?" My voice cracked, small, unbelieving. He leaned back in his chair as though discussing the weather. "The baby is here, and we need to talk about how we're going to handle this." Handle this, as though it was a business, acquisition, as though my marriage, my dignity, my life could be reduced to logistics. My pulse pounded in my ears, rage and shock blurring my vision. "You want me to raise her child?" My voice rose, trembling with disbelief. He didn't flinch. "Our child," he corrected smoothly, "because as my wife, it's your responsibility. My duty is to provide, and yours is to keep the family together. That includes the baby." The audacity left me speechless. My lips parted, but no words came. He spoke as though I was a vessel, an extension of his choices, someone with no will of her own. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was degradation. I slammed my hand against the table, the sound sharp and startling even to me. "Don't you dare call that my child. Don't you dare twist this into my responsibility." His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening with irritation, rather than shame. "Stop being dramatic. What do you think people will say if you walk away now? You'll look weak, bitter, incapable of forgiveness. My family will never accept you if you abandon your duty. Do you want to be remembered as the wife who couldn't even keep her home together? The cruelty in his words was staggering. He wasn't asking, he was demanding, weaponizing society, family, and reputation against me. He knew the weight of those expectations, knew how women are judged, knew the shame culture could smother me with if I refused. Tears stung my eyes, hot and relentless, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. "You betrayed me," I whispered, voice shaking. "And now you want me to raise proof of that betrayal under my roof?" He leaned forward, his tone low, threatening. "You will. Because if you don't, you'll lose everything. My support, my family's support, the respectability you cling to. Think carefully before you say no." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The walls of the room closed in around me, the air suffocating. Rage bubbled beneath my skin, but it was trapped under layers of fear and humiliation. He wasn't just forcing me to accept the child. He was forcing me to accept my own erasure, to become invisible in my own marriage. Days blurred after that night. Whispers circulated through the family, uncles and aunts calling, their voices dripping with veiled commands disguised as advice. A wife must endure. A woman's strength is in her sacrifice. Children are innocent. You mustn't punish them for their parents' sins. Each phrase was another chain wrapped around my neck, another reminder that society would rather see me silenced than see him held accountable. And then I saw the baby for the first time. She was small, delicate, with wide eyes that mirrored his. He placed her in my arms as though it were inevitable, as though I were nothing more than a vessel designed to nurture his mistakes. I stared down at the child, torn apart by conflicting emotions, hatred for the circumstances, pity for her innocence, and a bone-deep ache for the life I had been denied. "You'll learn to love her," he said, his tone final, leaving no room for refusal. But what he didn't understand was this: love cannot be forced, and loyalty cannot be demanded from ashes. Every day I fed the child, clothed her, soothed her cries. My resentment grew, not toward her, but toward him. Every coo and smile was a reminder of his betrayal. Every time I rocked her to sleep, I remembered the nights I had dreamed of cradling our child, only to have that dream stolen. Humiliation became my daily companion. His family praised me for my strength, their words dripping with hypocrisy. Behind their smiles, I could feel their satisfaction. The dutiful wife, raising proof of her husband's infidelity, cementing her place in shame. They called it honor. I called it torment. At night, when the house fell quiet, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched, my body vibrating with rage. He thought he had broken me, thought he had cornered me into submission with the weight of society's expectations. But he didn't know me. Not truly. My silence was not consent. My compliance was not weakness. Because deep inside, beneath the humiliation and despair, something sharper was being forged. His arrogance, his cruelty, his complete lack of remorse, they were the sparks that lit a fire I could no longer ignore. And as I rocked the baby one night, humming softly into the darkness, I made myself a promise. One day, he would regret forcing me into this role. One day he would learn that I was not the kind of woman who could be erased. For now, I would play the part he wrote for me. But the story was mine to finish. Morning light streamed into the nursery, soft and golden. But to me it felt more like a spotlight exposing the prison I had been forced into. The cries of the baby pierced the quiet dawn, dragging me out of bed long before my body or mind was ready. I stumbled toward the crib, exhaustion pulling at my limbs, resentment burning in my chest. She looked at me with wide, trusting eyes, completely innocent, completely unaware that her very existence was the weapon used against me. I fed her, rocked her, changed her, going through the motions of motherhood that I had once dreamed of experiencing, but not like this. Never like this. Every gentle touch, every lullaby whispered into the night was an act I performed with my body, while my soul detached, hovering in a cloud of bitterness. This was not my child, yet I was expected to be her mother in every way. I resented my husband for placing me in this role, and I resented myself for complying. Family and friends no longer looked at me the same way. Some pitied me, their eyes soft with sympathy, but sharp with unspoken judgment. Others praised me, calling me selfless, as though I had willingly chosen this humiliation. Their words were daggers disguised as compliments. "You're such a good woman, taking this on. Not every wife could do what you're doing." I wanted to scream that I hadn't chosen any of this, that my silence was not nobility, it was survival. But instead, I smiled weakly and let them believe what they wanted, because fighting their perceptions was yet another battle I didn't have the strength to fight. My husband, of course, thrived in this narrative. To outsiders, he appeared as the respectable man whose wife had forgiven him, whose household had miraculously survived scandal. And he knew how to twist the knife. On nights when I recoiled from him, when I couldn't bear his presence in my bed, he would whisper manipulative words. "If you really loved me, you'd accept this. You're punishing an innocent child for my mistake. Do you want to be the kind of woman who can't forgive?" Every phrase was a carefully crafted trap, designed to make me question myself, to make me feel small and cruel. I began to shrink under the weight of it, living a life where every smile was forced, every breath was laced with bitterness. I was a ghost in my own home, existing only to fulfill duties I never asked for. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. The routine became mechanical: feed, bathe, soothe, repeat. At times I caught myself softening toward the baby despite everything. She was innocent, after all. Her tiny hand would curl around my finger, and for a fleeting second, I felt something maternal stir inside me. But almost immediately, guilt and fury would flood in. That tenderness wasn't supposed to be hers. It was supposed to belong to the child I had once longed for, the one I had imagined with my husband before he shattered everything. The isolation grew heavier. Friends stopped calling, unsure of what to say to me. Family offered platitudes but no real comfort. And my husband, he was always there, hovering, praising me when it suited him, condemning me when I showed even a flicker of resistance. "You're stronger than I thought," he said once, smiling smugly as though I should thank him for the compliment. What he didn't realize was that strength was the very thing keeping me from collapsing into despair, and the same strength that would eventually fuel my revenge. I swallowed my emotions daily, pressing them down like coals under ash. To the world, I was the dutiful wife, the reluctant mother who had risen above scandal. But inside, I was seething. Each manipulation, each patronizing remark, each night of silent tears carved lines into my heart, lines that slowly began to form a plan. One evening, as I sat in the nursery rocking the baby to sleep, I caught my reflection in the window. My face was pale, my eyes hollow, my body slouched with exhaustion. But behind that weariness was something sharper, a glint of defiance that I hadn't noticed before. For the first time in months, I saw myself not as a victim, but as someone waiting, preparing. Because revenge doesn't come in sudden bursts of rage. It simmers, it builds, it sharpens itself quietly in the shadows. And in that nursery, with the child of betrayal resting against my chest, I realized that I was no longer just enduring. I was planning. I let him believe he had won, that I had been broken into submission. I let his family praise me, let society paint me as the epitome of sacrifice. But underneath it all, I was gathering strength, one painful day at a time. Each Sleepless night. Each forced smile, each manipulation I endured was a brick in the foundation of something bigger. He thought forcing me into motherhood had chained me to him forever. What he didn't see was that those chains were slowly becoming my weapons. One day I would turn them against him. One day he would understand that the woman he thought he had erased was still here, quiet, patient, and more dangerous than he could ever imagine. And as I kissed the baby's forehead that night, whispering a lullaby with a steady voice, I made a vow to myself. This role may have been forced upon me, but the ending will be mine to write. It happened on a night that was supposed to be ours. Our wedding anniversary, a day I had once cherished, a day that used to remind me of promises whispered under candlelight and dreams built on fragile hopes. I had told myself not to expect anything, not to fall into the trap of believing he might remember the meaning behind this date. But some stubborn, naive part of me had clung to the fantasy that maybe, just maybe, he would try. When I walked into the dining room, I was met not with intimacy, but with spectacle. The table was decorated, yes, but not for me. He had invited colleagues, family members, even his mistress. She was there, seated comfortably as though she belonged, her child cradled in her arms, while I hovered at the edge of the room like an uninvited guest in my own life. He raised a glass, his smile confident, his voice carrying across the room. To my wife, who has been nothing but supportive, and to the woman who gave me the gift of life through our child. The words sliced through me like a blade. He toasted both of us, me, the dutiful fool, and her, the one who had taken what was mine. The guests clapped politely, pretending not to see the way my face drained of color. I sat stiffly, every nerve burning, every muscle screaming to run, or scream or throw the glass in his smug face. Instead, I stayed still, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. I had never felt smaller. The final insult came when the child, her child, his child, looked up at me and called me Auntie. The room laughed softly, a ripple of amusement passing through the guests as though it were some sweet mistake. My husband chuckled too, ruffling the child's hair, and his mistress's smile widened ever so slightly, triumphant and smug. Something in me cracked then, a soundless shattering deep within, like glass breaking in the dark. I kept my head down, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears that burned in my eyes. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, not here, not now. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of noise and chatter, but I barely heard a word. Every detail etched itself into my mind. The way he placed his hand casually on the mistress's arm, the way family members avoided my gaze, the way whispers swirled at the edges of the room. They all saw me as the woman who had endured, the woman who had swallowed her pride for the sake of peace. They pitied me. They thought I had no power left. But pity is a dangerous thing. It underestimates the strength of the broken. That night, lying in bed beside the man who had humiliated me in front of everyone we knew, I stared at the ceiling while he slept soundly. His breathing was even, calm, oblivious. I replayed the scene again and again. The toast, the laughter, the child's innocent slip of the tongue. My body trembled, not from weakness, but from a rage so cold it felt almost like clarity. For months I had endured, convincing myself that survival was enough. I had told myself that silence was strength, that patience was virtue. But silence had only given him permission to continue. Patience had only given him confidence to humiliate me further. As I lay there in the dark, one thought crystallized so sharply it cut through all the noise in my mind. He will regret underestimating me. The woman he believed he had broken was gone. What remained was something sharper, harder, forged in betrayal and humiliation. I thought of the guests' pitying stares, of his mistress's smug smile, of the word auntie echoing like a cruel joke. Each memory was fuel, each slight a spark feeding the fire inside me. I turned to look at him, sleeping peacefully beside me, his features relaxed in arrogance, in comfort. How easy it was for him. He believed I was defeated, that I would continue, playing the role he had written for me. Caretaker, silent wife, convenient shield against scandal. He thought he had me trapped, but he had forgotten something vital. A cage doesn't erase the predator inside it. It only sharpens its hunger. The decisions settled into me like steel, solid and unyielding. There would be no more begging for scraps. Of respect, no more waiting for apologies that would never come. I would no longer be the woman who endured quietly. From this night forward, I would be the woman who acted. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to plan. Revenge doesn't bloom in fire. It grows in ice, in silence, in patience sharpened into strategy. He had pushed me past the point of endurance. Now he would learn what happens when a woman with nothing left to lose decides she will no longer play the victim. My breaking point had arrived, and with it, a transformation. He thought this night was his victory, proof of his dominance. But one day soon, he would look back and realize that this was the night his downfall truly began. Because, while he slept believing himself untouchable, I was awake, wide awake, with vengeance burning steady in my veins. The night of my breaking point became the seed of a new life. I woke the next morning with the same face, the same duties, the same carefully constructed mask. But inside, everything had shifted. I was no longer his obedient wife. I was no longer the woman who silently swallowed betrayal. I was a hunter, and the man sleeping beside me was prey. I understood immediately that revenge wasn't something I could unleash recklessly. A single outburst, a single misstep, and he would twist the narrative to paint me as bitter, unstable, or ungrateful. I had watched him lie effortlessly to colleagues, manipulate relatives, and charm strangers into believing he was the perfect man. If I wanted to win, I had to play his game better than he did. So I smiled. I cooked breakfast, poured his coffee, kissed his cheek, and asked about his schedule. I played the role of the devoted wife with a precision that would have impressed even him. On the surface, I was the same woman he thought he had broken. Beneath, every word, every gesture was a calculated performance. My silence was no longer endurance. It was strategy. The first step was information. If he had built his empire of arrogance on lies, then I would dig until I unearthed every rotten foundation. I began with his phone. At first, I only glanced when he left it carelessly on the table, noting patterns: calls late at night, messages deleted, banking apps accessed at odd hours. I didn't confront him. Instead, I memorized, observed, and stored details in the quiet corners of my mind. Soon, I graduated to subtle moves. While he showered, I backed up his texts to a cloud account he didn't know existed. I photographed receipts left in his pockets, lavish dinners charged to accounts he claimed were empty, hotel bookings under fake names, gifts purchased with joint funds but never given to me. Each detail was another thread in the net I was weaving, invisible to him but tightening around his neck. But betrayal is rarely just emotional. I sensed, beneath the surface, financial secrets that could ruin him if exposed. He had always been careless with money, too confident in his ability to bluff and manipulate. I began combing through documents he assumed I never touched. Tax returns, bank statements, contracts. At first, the numbers blurred, but patience became my ally. I taught myself to read the fine print, to recognize discrepancies, to connect dots he never thought I'd see. Slowly, patterns emerged: hidden accounts, misreported income, transfers to names I didn't recognize. Fraud was etched into every page, arrogance dripping from every lie he signed. All the while, I played my role flawlessly. At dinner, I asked about his day with feigned interest. When he mentioned business trips, I nodded, pretending not to notice, the cologne lingering on his jacket or the faint lipstick stains he had missed. When he brought his mistress's child into our home, I tucked the child into bed with a forced smile, even as my chest ached with humiliation. Every act of obedience became another layer of camouflage, concealing the storm I was quietly building. But secrecy is not only about what you gather, it's about how you hide. I created folders on an old laptop, buried under mundane file names, recipes, household budgets, grocery lists. Inside them were photos of receipts, screenshots of text exchanges, bank transactions, and incriminating emails. I encrypted everything, saved backups to flash drives hidden in places he would never search. The lining of my winter coat, an old shoebox of childhood letters, the false bottom of a jewelry box. If he ever suspected me, he would find nothing. Suspense became my constant companion. Every time I copied a file or slipped a receipt into my pocket, my heart raced as though I were stealing from a vault guarded by lions. But fear did not weaken me. It sharpened me. The more evidence I collected, the more powerful I felt. I was no longer trapped. I was building an escape, a weapon, a future where he could no longer touch me. And still, I played the perfect wife. I laughed when he made cruel jokes at my expense in front of friends. I nodded when he lectured me about loyalty. I even thanked him when he reminded me with smug arrogance that I was lucky he had chosen me despite my flaws. Each act of submission was hollow on the surface, but filled with venom beneath. I was feeding his ego so he would never see the dagger I was, sharpening behind my back. The more evidence I gathered, the more I realized that his betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. He cheated not only on me but on everyone around him, his investors, his colleagues, even his family. He lied to them all, covering his tracks with charm and bravado. That realization fueled me further. My revenge wouldn't just be about reclaiming my dignity. It would be about stripping away his mask in front of the entire world. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, consumed by both fear and exhilaration. Fear of what would happen if he discovered my secret work. Exhilaration at imagining the moment his empire crumbled under the weight of his own lies. I pictured the look in his eyes when he realized the obedient wife he had dismissed for years was the architect of his downfall. That image was my anchor, my fuel, my salvation. To the outside world, nothing had changed. We were still the married couple hosting dinners, attending family events, smiling for photographs. But beneath that polished facade, a secret war was underway, one he didn't even know he was losing. My planning was not impulsive. It was meticulous, deliberate, precise. Every step was calculated to protect me and to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no escape for him. I was no longer a victim stumbling in the shadows of his betrayals. I was a strategist, orchestrating his collapse one piece at a time. And though I hadn't yet struck, I could already feel the power shifting. For the first time in years, I wasn't drowning under his control. I was the one tightening the ropes. He believed I was still trapped, still broken, still obedient. But the truth was clear. His downfall had already begun the night I decided to stop enduring and start planning. He thought I was his shield. Soon he would learn I was his executioner. Revenge is not fire and fury. It is patience finally erupting into precision. For years, I had been silent, playing the role of the dutiful wife while stitching together every thread of his deception. Now, the tapestry was complete, and all it required was for me to pull one string. It began with the documents. I had spent months compiling them, proof of tax fraud, hidden accounts, false expense reports, and business dealings that could sink him if they ever reached the wrong eyes. I didn't simply hand them to the authorities. That would have been too simple. Instead, I distributed them like seeds in a storm. An anonymous package sent to his investors, another slipped into the inbox of a relentless journalist, and still, another delivered to the financial regulators who had been circling his industry for years. Each recipient received a different piece of the puzzle, but together the picture was damning. The effect was almost immediate. At first, it was small, his phone buzzing more than usual, his tone clipped when speaking to business partners, a restless tension in his movements. Then came the storm. Investors pulled out. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Headlines appeared with words he could not control. Allegations of fraud, financial misconduct, hidden accounts. Exposed, his perfect mask began to crack, and I watched, calmly, as panic flickered in his eyes for the first time. But I wasn't finished. His social life had been his pride, the elegant dinners, the charming public appearances, the reputation as a family man who commanded admiration. I chose the night of our wedding anniversary dinner to strike hardest. He had arranged a grand celebration at an upscale restaurant, inviting colleagues, friends, and family. I dressed in silence, wearing the calm of someone who had already won. The evening began with his usual arrogance, toasts in his honor, self-congratulation disguised as modesty, laughter at jokes I had heard 1,000 times. And then, like clockwork, the first guest's phone buzzed with a headline. Another guest received a confidential email that had been mysteriously leaked. Within minutes, whispers spread like wildfire around the table. Eyes that had once looked at him with admiration now glistened with suspicion. I sat at his side, my smile serene, as he stumbled through excuses, his words cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. For years he had humiliated me in private, dismissing my worth, forcing me into roles I had never chosen. Now, in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress, he was the one stripped bare. The silence at the table was deafening, filled with the kind of judgment he could never escape. And still, I wasn't done. Financial ruin was next. While he scrambled to salvage his collapsing empire, I released the final set of documents, records of him funneling money into accounts under his mistress's name. Not only did it expose his infidelity, it tied his downfall directly to the woman he had once elevated above me. The betrayal he had forced me to endure was now publicly carved into his reputation. He had mocked me for raising her child. Now the world mocked him for funding her lavish life with stolen money. The collapse was total. Regulators froze his accounts. His investors abandoned him. His colleagues refused to take his calls. Even his family, the ones who had once scolded me for not being more understanding, distanced themselves in shame. He went from power to pariah in weeks, and I remained untouched, because every move I made was quiet, careful, untraceable. To the outside world, I was still the loyal wife, blindsided by her husband's disgrace. I played the role with the same precision I had used during my planning. When people offered me sympathetic looks, I lowered my eyes modestly. When they whispered their apologies for what I must be going through, I nodded with quiet dignity. Little did they know, I had orchestrated every note of this downfall. But revenge wasn't just about destruction. It was about reclamation. For years he had taken from me my inheritance, my peace, my dignity. Now I reclaimed them piece by piece. With his assets frozen, I was able to secure what was legally mine, money he had tried to withhold. With his reputation ruined, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, I was not the silent, obedient wife, but the resilient woman who had endured betrayal with grace. Doors opened for me that had once been slammed shut, not because I sought sympathy, but because people saw strength in my silence. The most powerful moment, though, wasn't public. It came one night, when he finally confronted me. His once booming voice was ragged, broken. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, were dull with desperation. "Did you know about all this?" he asked, suspicion lacing his trembling tone. I looked at him, calm and unflinching. "I knew everything," I said. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. He saw it then. The years of quiet obedience had not been submission. They had been strategy. The wife he thought he controlled had been the architect of his collapse all along. In that moment, I felt no rage, no gloating triumph. Just clarity. He had underestimated me, and it had cost him everything. I didn't need to scream, didn't need to remind him of the nights I cried myself to sleep or the humiliation I endured. My revenge was complete in the emptiness of his eyes. Contrast framed the victory perfectly. Years of silence, endured humiliation, suppressed rage, all culminating in an explosion of justice he never saw coming. For him, it was ruin. For me, it was liberation. I walked away not with bitterness, but with power. His downfall did not heal every wound, but it freed me from the cage he had built around me. My silence had been the calm before the storm, and my storm had erased him from the heights he once ruled. And in the end, revenge was not fire. It was truth, unleashed with precision. The storm had passed, but its wreckage was everywhere. The man who once strutted through life with arrogance and power now looked like a shadow, hollow, defeated, and utterly alone. His downfall was not sudden anymore. It was a slow erosion, a daily stripping away of everything he thought untouchable. The first blow was to his reputation. News outlets feasted on the scandal, dissecting every sordid detail of his fraud and infidelity. Business associates who once bragged about their ties to him now pretended they had never known him. Invitations to the lavish circles he loved so dearly stopped arriving. The same society that had once bowed to his charm now recoiled from his disgrace. Overnight, he had transformed from a celebrated man of influence into a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. Then came the financial collapse. Accounts were frozen, assets seized, and investments liquidated under scrutiny. The home that had once symbolized his success became a cage of creditors and legal notices. Luxury cars, vacation homes, and the symbols of status he flaunted, all disappeared piece by piece. Watching him lose grip on the wealth he had once weaponized against me was not just justice, it was irony. He had built his identity on money, and without it, he was no one. But the deepest wound came from within his personal life. The mistress he had once paraded in secret, the woman for whom he had destroyed our marriage, abandoned him the moment his empire crumbled. Her loyalty had never been to him. It had been to his bank account, his prestige, the illusion of power. When the money dried up, so did her affection. She walked away without hesitation, leaving him bitter and bewildered, as though betrayal were something only he had the right to commit. And what of the child? For years, he had forced me into a role I never chose, raising a living reminder of his betrayal, a child born not of my love, but of his cruelty. But now, I set boundaries. I was clear. The child was not my responsibility. I stepped back, refusing to bear the burden of his sins any longer. The weight I had carried, silently, resentfully, was lifted. It was not an act of cruelty, but of liberation. For the first time, I was free to choose what I carried, and I chose myself. He tried, of course, to cling to me when everything else slipped away. Men like him don't love, they possess. And when their possessions are gone, they return to the one thing they assume will remain loyal. He called me, begged me, even accused me of abandoning him in his time of need. But I had no guilt left to give. I had endured years of his manipulation, his arrogance, his selfishness. His downfall was not my doing. It was the harvest of the seeds he himself had sown. Meanwhile, my life began to bloom in unexpected ways. Freed from the suffocating grip of his control, I discovered strength in places I had once thought broken. I rebuilt not just financially but emotionally, reclaiming the pieces of myself I had hidden away to survive. Where he was losing everything, I was gaining clarity, peace, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I had endured the worst and risen above it. The contrast was stark. He became a ghost haunting the ruins of his own empire, angry, bitter, forgotten. I, on the other hand, began to live again. I laughed without fear of mockery. I slept without the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I stepped into rooms no longer defined as his wife, but as myself, a woman who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. His downfall was complete not because he lost wealth, power, or even his mistress. It was complete because he lost control, the one thing he had always wielded over everyone, especially me. And as I watched him stumble through the wreckage of his own making, I felt no urge for revenge anymore. That chapter had already been written. What remained now was freedom. I walked, away not carrying his name, not carrying his burdens, not carrying his shame. I walked away carrying only myself, stronger, wiser, and finally whole. Because in the aftermath of betrayal, the greatest victory is not in watching your betrayer fall. It is in standing tall while they crumble, knowing they can never touch you again. Looking back, it feels almost surreal. The journey from devastation to liberation, from silence to strength. Betrayal had once felt like a prison I could never escape. I remember those nights when I lay awake, asking myself how my life had unraveled into a cruel joke. The wife forced to raise the evidence of her husband's infidelity. At the time, it felt like the end of me. But in truth, it was the beginning of who I was meant to become. Revenge is often painted as ugly, as destructive, as something that poisons the soul. But for me, it was not about vengeance for its own sake. It was about reclaiming myself from the ashes of humiliation. It was about showing him, and myself, that I was not a pawn in his story, but the author of my own. Every move I made to dismantle his arrogance was less about punishing him and more about freeing me. When people ask how betrayal feels, they expect words like anger or sadness. But the truth is, betrayal is silence. It is the hollow pause between heartbeats when you realize the life you thought you had never existed. It is the suffocating weight of trust shattered into 1,000 pieces. Yet, what I learned is that even silence can be powerful because silence can become strategy. I let him believe my stillness was weakness, when in fact, it was the storm gathering within me. Today, I no longer see myself as the victim of his choices. I see myself as the woman who rose from them. He tried to chain me to his sins, to make me raise what he called our responsibility, when in reality, it was only his mistake. He thought he had broken me beyond repair, but he never realized that in trying to bury me under betrayal, he was actually planting the seeds of my strength. Closure did not come the day he lost his wealth or when his mistress abandoned him. Closure came the moment I stopped defining myself by his actions and started defining myself by my own survival. It came when I realized that revenge was not about watching him crumble. It was about rising while he fell. I am not naive. I know. Life will continue to test me, to present challenges that shake my faith in people. But I will never again hand over the power of my happiness to someone else. That is the true gift betrayal gave me. The clarity to protect my boundaries, the wisdom to value myself above anyone else's approval, and the strength to walk away without hesitation. To anyone who has been where I once was, silenced, betrayed, burdened, I say this: do not mistake endurance for weakness. Sometimes surviving quietly is the boldest act of all. Sometimes silence is not surrender, but preparation. And sometimes the sweetest justice is not in destroying the one who wronged you, but in building a life they can never touch. My journey is proof that even in the cruelest betrayal, there can be rebirth. Even in forced roles, we can choose our endings. Even in silence, there is power waiting to be spoken. He thought I would raise his mistake forever, but instead, I buried his pride and raised my own strength.